Every surviving party needs a good cook, and Bruno is the perfect person to fill that role. Welcome back to a survivor's guide to this war of mine. Today we will be going over Bruno, both his mechanics and his story. Bruno has the trait good cook, which makes sense given that he had a cooking show before the war. This trait gives him the ability to make food and alcohol with fewer ingredients, saving your survivors valuable resources. This includes only needing 3 water and 1 fuel for a meal on a crude stove, or only 5 water for 2 meals. This reduces further to 2 and 3 water on the improved stove, respectively. For making moonshine, he only needs 3 sugar and water, and to refine it, he only needs 1 of the 2 fuel. Finally, he only needs half the materials to make medication in the improved medical workshop, with 2 herbs and 1 med part being needed. His other mechanics include an average cavering capacity of 10, pretty mediocre combat and guarding ranks of D and C, and an addiction to smoking. He is also quite a poor consoler, but can deal with negative situations quite well as he is an egoist. Now that we've worked through his mechanics, we can move on to his story. We'll start with his good story, then his bad story, then look at his endings. Bruno's good story. Number 1. I used to be an optimist, one of those people who would have sworn that the war wouldn't come. Wars happened far away, in third world countries, or so I thought. Even when I was listening to the news getting scarier day by day, I did not believe at all what was about to happen. Number 2. I have a dearest friend who always worried a lot. One day she called me, terrified, saying there was a riot outside. The secessionists were inciting the crowd to burn the town hall. I told her not to worry, and I was right. Nothing came of it, this time. But even when the riots and fights became everyday news, I kept assuring her it would all blow over soon. Number 3. I have a house just outside the city and ride a bus to work. One day, I was in my restaurant here in Pogoran, not really noticing the muted TV showing some scenes of heavy fighting, and suddenly I recognized the location. It was my town. My friend was there. With pounding heart, I grabbed my coat and rushed towards the sounds of gunfire. Number 4. At the bus station, I learnt from the other commuters that we were under siege, and no bus toward my town would leave. I was shattered. If it wasn't for me, my friend would have left the town and gone abroad to her aunt, but I convinced her to stay. And now I don't know if she's well. I haven't heard from her since the siege began. Bruno's bad story. People are fools, but I was their king. I used to think that whatever our differences, we won't just start shooting each other one day. That is something other people do, not us. We lived together for centuries. We are a civilized nation. Stupidity is lethal. Mine probably killed my dearest friend. Number 2. I answered the phone one day, and it was my friend, incoherent, crying that there was a crowd outside her house and how they were going to burn everything and she had to flee the country. I calmed her as well as I could. Fortunately, the crowd dispersed soon, and I kept soothing her fears in the coming weeks. Did a really good job with that. She decided to stay. Number 3. I was in the restaurant, watching the patrons argue over their dinner and not really noticing the news showing some heavy fighting, when it hit me. They're showing the Pogoran outskirts. It's my town, where my friend lives. I don't know what I was hoping for when I rushed out the door and to the bus station. Number 4. It was too late. The siege was on. We were already cut off. All rides to my town were cancelled. And it was already too late to do anything for my friend anyway. I should have thought about that before I lulled her into a false sense of security. I don't know what happened to her. Most likely I'll never learn, but I fear the worst. Bruno's story is a story of not believing that the worst will come. If he is in your surviving party, his ending will depend on your actions. If Bruno dies, despite his valiant struggle, Bruno didn't make it through the war. The fate of his friend he was worried about remains unknown. If Bruno kills himself, after having lost all hope, Bruno tied the noose around his neck. His last thoughts were of his last friend, and of what could have been but wasn't meant to be. If Bruno decides to leave the shelter. Bruno left the shelter one night. He was trying to reach his friend, and got shot while attempting to slip between army pickets. If you reject Bruno when he comes to the door. Bruno was denied refuge in the shelter. His fate beyond that day remains unknown. If Bruno gets through the war, but with bad karma. After the ceasefire, Bruno went looking for his friend. Her neighbourhood witnessed heavy fighting, and most of the houses were reduced to ruins. She was nowhere to be found, and her neighbours did not know what happened to her. Bruno never saw her again. If Bruno gets through the war, but is ending up sad and broken from the experience. After the ceasefire, Bruno went looking for his friend. Her neighbourhood saw heavy fighting, and most of the houses had been reduced to ruins, but she found shelter in the basement which held. Eating rats and scavenging scraps of food, she somehow managed to survive. Bruno felt responsible for her misery. He has never forgiven himself. And finally, if Bruno manages to make it through the war without being broken and without committing atrocities. After the ceasefire, Bruno set off looking for his friend. Her neighbourhood saw heavy fighting and the majority of the housing had been reduced to ruins, but she found shelter in the basement which somehow held. Despite the hardships, she managed to survive and was happy to see Bruno alive as well. They remain friends to this very day. So that's Bruno. I hope you have found this interesting. If you have, please do like, subscribe, and consider donating to War Child. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. Ta-ra.